I remember she hesitated before selling it. She said it belonged to someone dear to her. I asked if she was sure, and she said she had her reasons. He felt his chest tighten. Did she say her name? The old man shook his head. No, she didn't. But I do remember she said something strange. She said, "If the right person finds it, they'll understand." He froze for a second. Understand what? The old man gave a small shrug. I wish I knew. Maybe it's meant to be discovered slowly, like the way stories unfold in time. He thanked the old man and stepped out, the rain beginning to fall softly. He stood there for a while, letting the drops hit his face. The words echoed in his mind. If the right person finds it, they'll understand. Who was that woman? And why did she sound like she already knew someone specific would find the watch? On his way home, he kept replaying every small detail. Maybe the engraving was connected to something deeper, something personal. But how could a random watch in a forgotten shop have anything to do with him? He had never owned a similar one before. Or had he? When he reached home, he placed the watch on the table again and just stared at it. The second hand moved steadily, almost hypnotic. He remembered how the old woman at the bus stop said it looked familiar, that someone she knew had one just like it. Maybe that was a clue. He picked up his phone and searched online for the brand engraved near the crown. It was an old make, one that had stopped production decades ago. Most pieces were sold in limited numbers. Then he saw something that made him pause. There was an image of the same model on a vintage website, and below it was a short description. Special edition gifted to families of soldiers who never returned home. He leaned back slowly, his breath catching. That couldn't be a coincidence. He read further. Each of those watches had a small engraving, customized by the families. They were given as mementos of love, faith, and waiting. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Could this watch have belonged to someone who had lost a loved one in service? If so, what did that message mean? For the one who still believes. Believe in what? Hope? Reunion? The thought sent a chill down his spine. Suddenly, the weight of the watch on his wrist felt heavier, filled with history he didn't understand yet. The next few days passed, but he couldn't shake off the curiosity. Every time he looked at the watch, he felt it was calling him to uncover the truth. So on his next day off, he decided to visit the local archive office. It wasn't far from the old market. If the watch really belonged to a family connected to a soldier, maybe there'd be some record somewhere. The clerk at the archive, an elderly woman with kind eyes, listened to him patiently as he explained the story. She smiled gently when he showed her the watch. You'd be surprised how many stories these old things hold, she said. Let's see what we can find. They searched through some old newspaper records and donation logs from the vintage community. After a while, the woman looked up. I think I found something that might match. She handed him a faded document listing lost personal items once owned by families who had submitted them for preservation. Among the listed items was a watch with the exact same inscription. His heart pounded as he read it. Next to the description was a name, not the owner's, but the one who had gifted it. The donor was listed as a woman who lived not far from the city. He carefully copied down the address. It was an old part of town near the hills, a place he'd only passed by a few times. That evening, he stood at his window again, the paper folded in his hand. The city lights blinked below and the sound of traffic hummed in the distance. He glanced at the watch once more. The ticking was steady, calming. He couldn't explain why, but it felt as though it wanted him to go there, to follow whatever path it was trying to show him. He sat on the edge of his bed, thinking about the woman in the shop, the old lady at the bus stop, and now this address that had somehow connected all the dots. Maybe this wasn't just about curiosity anymore. Maybe it was something more, something he was meant to find. Before sleeping, he placed the watch on the table again and whispered softly, If you really have something to show me, I'll follow. The next morning, he decided. He would visit that address. He didn't know who he'd meet there or what he'd find, but one thing was clear now. The watch wasn't just an old piece of metal. It was a key, one that might open the door to a story that had waited years to be heard. As the dawn broke and sunlight touched the edge of his room, the watch ticked softly, like a quiet agreement that his journey had truly begun. The morning air was cool when he set out for the address written on the piece of paper. The city was just waking up. Shops were opening. The smell of tea drifted from small roadside stalls and buses growled past in clouds of smoke. He held the watch tightly in his hand as if afraid something might happen to it. The address led him toward the older side of the city, where the streets grew quieter and houses looked aged but peaceful. The buildings here carried stories of their own, walls that had seen laughter, tears, and time itself. After about an hour, he reached a narrow lane shaded by tall trees. The number on the gate matched the one written on the paper. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what he would say or how he would even begin. Then, taking a deep breath, he walked through the small gate and knocked on the wooden door. For a long time, nothing happened. Just as he was about to leave, the door opened slowly. An elderly woman appeared. Her hair was silver, tied neatly at the back, and her face carried both warmth and tiredness, the kind that comes from years of waiting. She looked at him with a hint of surprise, as if trying to place him. "Yes?" she said gently. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am. My name is... Well, I bought a watch recently from a shop in the city. It had an engraving on it, and when I looked into it, your name appeared in an old record connected to it." Her eyes widened slightly. "A watch?" she repeated softly. He nodded and carefully showed it to her. "This one." For a few seconds, she said nothing. Her gaze locked onto the watch and her expression changed, something between shock and deep emotion. She reached out with trembling hands and touched it gently as if it were something precious she hadn't seen in years. Where did you find this?" she whispered. "I bought it from a vintage shop near the market. The shopkeeper said it was sold by someone who didn't leave a name. I just wanted to know the story behind it." The woman took a step back, motioning him to come inside. "Please," she said softly. "Come in." He followed her through a small hallway filled with framed photographs, old books, and the faint scent of lavender. The living room had an old wooden clock on the wall ticking softly. She sat down on a chair near the window and gestured for him to sit opposite her. "I never thought I'd see that watch again," she said after a long pause. Her voice trembled slightly. "It belonged to my son." He sat silently, the sound of the clock filling the quiet. "He was a soldier," she continued, her eyes glistening. "He left home many years ago, full of dreams, full of courage. Before he went, I gave him that watch. It was his father's before him. I had the words engraved on it myself." She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the air as if tracing the memory. He said it would remind him to keep believing no matter what happened. He listened carefully, his heart heavy with emotion. "What happened to him?" he asked softly. She took a deep breath. "He never came back. They said there was an accident during a rescue mission. His body was never found." Her eyes lowered, voice breaking a little. "For years I waited. Every day I looked at the door thinking maybe he'd walk through it. But time went on and life grew quiet." She looked at the watch again, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned it over. "After a while I couldn't bear to see it anymore. It hurt too much. So I gave it away. I told myself that maybe someone else would find it and keep it alive. But I never imagined it would come back like this." The young man sat still, his throat tight. He didn't know what to say. It felt as though he had stepped into someone else's grief, but also into something strangely meaningful. "I don't know how," he said softly, "but I feel like this watch was meant to find me." She looked up at him, her eyes kind but searching. "Why do you say that?" He hesitated, then said, "Because before I found it, I'd been feeling lost, like I had nothing left to believe in. My days were all the same. When I saw the words on the back, it felt like they were written for me." The woman studied him for a moment, and a faint smile touched her lips. "Maybe they were," she said quietly. "Maybe my son wanted it that way. He believed that everything finds its way to where it's meant to be." The silence that followed was gentle, filled with understanding. After a few moments, she stood and walked to a small cabinet near the corner of the room. She opened a drawer and took out a photograph. It showed a young man in uniform, smiling brightly, holding the same watch on his wrist. She handed it to him. "He would have been about your age now," she said softly. "You even have a bit of his smile." He looked at the photo, his heart pounding. The resemblance was faint, but there. Something in the eyes, maybe the quietness in the expression. It was strange, almost unsettling, but also comforting. "I think," the woman said after a while, "this watch found you for a reason, maybe to remind you and me that time doesn't only take things away. Sometimes it brings them back. He nodded slowly, unable to speak. When he finally stood to leave, she held his hand gently and said, "You keep it. I think my son would have wanted that. Let it remind you to believe again." He wanted to refuse, to tell her she should keep it, but the way she said it felt final, like a gift from the past. He thanked her quietly, promising to take good care of it. As he stepped outside, the sky had turned a pale gold. The wind carried the soft scent of rain and earth. He looked down at the watch on his wrist, its face glinting faintly in the light. He could still feel the weight of her words, about belief, about time, about finding home. The walk back felt different. He didn't feel lost anymore. Something inside him had shifted. That night, when he sat by his window again, he replayed every word the woman had said. He imagined her son, the courage, the faith, the message he left behind. Somehow that message had reached him years later, across miles and memories. He realized now that the watch wasn't just a forgotten object. It was a bridge between two stories, hers and his. Between hope lost and hope found. Before sleeping, he looked at the watch one more time and whispered the words again, this time with meaning. For the one who still believes. Time has a way of leading you home. The ticking sounded softer that night, almost like a heartbeat, steady, alive, and full of promise. Days passed after he met the old woman, but her words stayed with him. Every night he would find himself looking at the watch before sleeping, almost like it was keeping him company. The ticking sound had become something familiar, a small rhythm that reminded him of that meeting, of her eyes when she spoke of her son, and the calm strength in her voice when she said, "Maybe it found you for a reason." He wore the watch every day now, not just because it was beautiful, but because it meant something. It had become a quiet reminder that life could still surprise him, that stories didn't always end in loss. But deep down, a small thought wouldn't leave his mind. Why did the watch seem to fit his wrist so perfectly? Why did the old woman say he even had a bit of her son's smile? It was a strange feeling, like the story wasn't finished yet. One evening, as he was organizing his small apartment, he came across an old box of his childhood things, yellowed notebooks, old photos, and a few letters his late father had kept. He hadn't opened that box in years. Something about the timing felt odd. The watch ticked quietly on his wrist as he sat on the floor and began going through the papers. Most of it was ordinary, school drawings, birthday cards, a few photographs. But then, at the very bottom, he found an envelope. It was old and fragile, and his name was written on it in handwriting he didn't recognize. He opened it carefully. Inside was a faded photograph. A man in a soldier's uniform, smiling, standing beside a few others. The strange thing was, on the man's wrist there was a familiar watch. The exact same one. His heart skipped a beat. He flipped the photo over. On the back, there was a short note written in his father's handwriting. "Your uncle gave his life serving the country. This was his watch once, passed to his family after he was lost. I promise to keep it safe until one day it finds its way back." He stared at the note, reading it again and again. His uncle? Could it be? His mind raced as the pieces slowly began to fit together. His father had never talked much about that part of the family. He only mentioned that his brother had gone missing during a mission years ago. But he never said anything about a watch. He sat back, his hands trembling slightly. That meant the woman he had met, the one who gave him the watch, was his uncle's mother. His grandmother. He felt his chest tighten. It couldn't be a coincidence. The address, the engraving, the message. Everything had led him there, without either of them knowing who the other truly was. He grabbed the watch and turned it over again, tracing the engraving with his thumb, for the one who still believes. Time has a way of leading you home. Suddenly those words felt different. They weren't just a message of hope anymore. They were a bridge between generations. All this time, without realizing it, he had been wearing a piece of his own family's history. The watch had traveled through years, through grief and loss, to return to him, to the one who still believed even when he didn't know it. He couldn't sit still. The next morning, he took the first bus back to the old neighborhood. The sky was cloudy, the air cool. When he reached her house, she looked surprised to see him again, but smiled gently, as if she'd been expecting him. "You came back," she said softly. He nodded, his throat tight. "I think I understand now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That watch, It belonged to my uncle. She froze, her eyes widening. Your uncle? He pulled the photo from his pocket and handed it to her. She took it slowly, her hands trembling. As her eyes fell on the picture, she gasped softly, covering her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes. That's him, she whispered. That's my son, he nodded. He was my father's brother. My dad wrote this on the back, he said, showing her the note. He promised to keep it safe. I didn't know until last night. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she held the photograph close to her chest. All these years, she said softly. I thought I'd lost every trace of him. I gave away the watch because I thought it was time to let go, but I never knew it would find its way back through family. He reached out gently, placing his hand over hers. It did, he said quietly. It found its way home. The two of them sat there in silence, surrounded by old memories and the soft ticking of time. It was as if the years between them had folded in half, closing the distance created by loss. After a while, she smiled through her tears. Your father used to visit me once in a while after the war. I remember his face. You look like both of them. He smiled back, his heart heavy and full all at once. I wish I had known sooner, he said. Maybe you were meant to find out now, she said, when you were ready to understand what belief really means. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, sharing stories, remembering the man who had once worn the watch. She showed him letters her son had written before he left, and he shared memories of his father, who had carried the pain quietly all those years. The connection felt natural, as if life had been gently guiding them to this moment. When it was time to leave, she pressed the watch back into his hand and said softly, It belongs to you now. It's home again. Keep believing and keep remembering. He promised he would. As he walked back down the narrow street, the clouds broke and a ray of sunlight spilled through, lighting up the path in front of him. He looked at the watch one more time, its face glimmering in the light. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, not just for himself, but for his father, for his grandmother, and for the man whose message had traveled through time to reach him. That night, when he sat by the window, the city lights looked softer. The watch ticked quietly on his wrist. Every sound a reminder of how life connects people in ways we can't always see. He smiled to himself, whispering the words that had started it all. For the one who still believes, time has a way of leading you home. And this time he truly understood what they meant. The days that followed felt lighter, calmer, and somehow fuller. The quiet rhythm of his life no longer felt empty. It had meaning now, not because everything had changed, but because he finally understood the value of the small moments that filled it. Each morning when he fastened the old watch on his wrist, he felt as though a part of his family's heartbeat moved with him. The steady ticking reminded him that time didn't always take things away. Sometimes it returned what truly belonged to you, not in the same form but in a way that healed old spaces inside your heart. He began visiting his grandmother regularly after that day. The first time he called her grandmother, she smiled quietly, her eyes softening in a way that words could never capture. She would make him tea and tell him stories about his uncle and his father, the kind of stories that never made it into letters or photographs. She told him about how his uncle used to fix broken radios, about the way he would hum to himself when he worked, about how he once said that people were like clocks, sometimes broken, sometimes late, but always trying to keep time in their own way. He listened to everything carefully, committing every story to memory. It felt like he was collecting lost pieces of a puzzle that finally made sense. Sometimes they would sit together in the garden as the evening light faded. She would close her eyes and listen to the ticking of the watch when he held it near her ear. It's strange, she once said softly. For years I tried to forget its sound. Now it feels like it never left. He smiled. Maybe it was just waiting for the right time. She nodded slowly. Time has a way of waiting too. We just don't always notice. One afternoon, while sorting through some old boxes in her home, he found a stack of unsent letters wrapped in a thin ribbon. They were addressed to his father, written by his grandmother years ago. Each letter was filled with love, hope, and faith that one day, her lost son's memory would return home. He read them all, tears blurring his vision. Each line spoke of waiting, of not giving up, of believing that somewhere, somehow, there was still a connection that time couldn't break. He gently placed the letters back and said quietly, "He came home, Grandma." Maybe not in the way you expected, but he did. She looked at him for a long moment, then smiled with tears in her eyes. Yes, she whispered. Through you. From that day onward, he carried the watch not as a mystery, but as a message. A reminder that life has a strange, beautiful way of connecting moments across time. He began noticing more around him. The kindness of strangers, the quiet strength in ordinary days. The stories hidden behind faces in the crowd. He even started writing again, something he had given up years ago. His first story was about the watch, about how a simple object could hold an entire life within it. But when he wrote it, he didn't focus on loss. He wrote about belief, about how holding on, even when you don't understand why, can lead you exactly where you need to be. Months later, his grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep. When he went through her belongings, he found a small note tucked inside her Bible. The handwriting was shaky but clear. It read, "If time has led this watch home, then my heart can finally rest. For the one who still believes, keep believing." He held the note to his chest for a long time, tears quietly falling. It felt like the story had come full circle, like her message and the watch had both completed their journey together. After the funeral, he went to the hill overlooking the city, the same one his uncle used to visit, according to his grandmother's stories. He stood there as the wind brushed against his face, the sky painted in shades of orange and gold. He took off the watch and held it in his palm. The light caught on its surface, and for a moment it seemed to shine brighter than ever. He didn't feel sadness anymore, just peace. He whispered softly, "Thank you for finding me." Then he placed the watch back on his wrist, smiling faintly. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning, a quiet promise to keep living, to keep believing, to carry forward the story that had found him. Years later, when he had his own family, he would tell his children the story of the watch. He never made it sound mystical or dramatic. He just said, "Sometimes life brings back what you thought was lost, not because you went looking for it, but because you were meant to find it." Whenever his children asked what the engraving meant, he would smile and say, "It's a reminder that no matter where you are in life, time has a way of leading you home." And as he grew older, that message only became more true. The watch still ticked soft and steady, as if echoing the heartbeat of everyone who had ever worn it. And every time he looked at it, he felt the warmth of all those who came before him. His father, his uncle, and the grandmother who never stopped believing. In the end, it wasn't about the watch at all. It was about connection, faith, and the quiet way life brings people together when they need it most. He had once thought he was just a man who bought a secondhand watch, but what he really bought was a story, one that reminded him and everyone who heard it that belief can travel across time, and that sometimes, even after all the years and distance, time really does lead you home. Years rolled by quietly, like pages turning in a book that had already told its main story, but still had something left to say. The man was older now, his hair streaked with gray, his hands lined with the kind of marks that come only from living, not from age alone, but from love, work, loss, and everything in between. The watch was still with him. Its band had been replaced twice, its glass polished more times than he could count, yet its heart, that soft, steady ticking, remained unchanged. Every morning he would wind it, listening for that faint sound that had once guided him through the hardest parts of his life. He had kept his promise to keep believing. He no longer saw the watch as a mystery or even a memory. It had become part of him, like a quiet companion that reminded him of where he had come from and who he had become. When he looked at it, he didn't just see time passing. He saw all the people and moments that had filled his years with meaning. His life had grown fuller. He had married, raised 2 children, and built a small but peaceful home on the outskirts of town. The world had changed in countless ways. Faster phones, quieter streets, fewer letters, more screens, but the watch stayed the same, its rhythm cutting through the noise of modern life. Sometimes his children would ask why he didn't just wear a smart watch like everyone else. He would laugh softly and tell them, "Because this one knows more about life than any new thing ever could." They would roll their eyes playfully, but deep down, they understood. They had grown up hearing the story, about how their father had found an old watch that somehow led him to his family's hidden past. They had listened to it so many times that they could retell it word for word, As the years passed, the watch became something like a quiet legend in the family. On birthdays or late evenings, his children would ask him to tell it again, not because they didn't remember, but because they loved the way he told it. He always spoke the same way, slow and gentle, as if the story was still unfolding somewhere out there. He would start with how he had been just another man trying to find meaning in ordinary days, and how one small object had changed everything. Then he would pause, touch the watch on his wrist and say, "Life doesn't always give you answers right away. Sometimes it gives you a question, and lets time reveal the truth." His daughter once asked him, "Do you think the watch chose you?" He smiled at that, a small, knowing smile. "Maybe it didn't choose me," he said. "Maybe it just waited for someone who still believed that things happen for a reason." She nodded, not quite understanding but sensing the weight of his words. One winter morning, when the first snow of the season covered the garden, he sat by the window with a cup of tea. His wife was reading across the room, the house quiet except for the ticking of the watch. He thought of his grandmother then, her soft voice, her faith, her stories. He thought of the note she had left behind, the words still clear in his mind. "If time has led this watch home, then my heart can finally rest." He whispered to himself, "It did, Grandma. It really did." Later that evening, he wrote a letter, not for anyone in particular, but for whoever might find it one day. It said, "This watch once belonged to a man who fixed broken things. It found its way back through time, through hands, through hearts, until it reached me. If you're reading this and it's still ticking, then remember, nothing good is ever truly lost. Sometimes it's just finding its way back." He folded the note neatly and placed it inside a small box with the watch, sealing it with care. He didn't know when or how it would be found next, but that was the beauty of it. The story wasn't meant to end with him. It was meant to travel, just like time itself. Years later, when he was gone, his children found the box. They opened it slowly, reading the note with quiet tears in their eyes. They looked at the watch, still ticking softly, still alive. His son said, "He really believed in it." His daughter smiled faintly. "No," she said. "He believed in people, and maybe that was what the watch had always been about. Not time, not fate, but connection. The invisible thread that runs between hearts, between generations, between stories waiting to be found." They decided to keep the watch together, not locked away, but somewhere it could be seen. Sometimes on quiet days they would take turns wearing it. It didn't feel like a memory. It felt like a promise, that no matter where life took them, they would keep believing just as their father had. And so the watch continued to tick, marking not just hours, but lives. It became more than a family heirloom. It became a reminder that every second carries a story, and that sometimes the smallest things hold the deepest meaning. Somewhere in another town, years from now, someone else might find that same watch in a small shop window, turning it over to see a faint engraving on the back. And when they read the words etched there, they might feel something stir inside them, a sense that time itself had something to say. Maybe they'll take it home. Maybe they'll wear it. Maybe without even realizing it, they'll become part of the story too, because some stories aren't meant to end. They just keep ticking softly and endlessly, like a heartbeat that belongs to everyone who still believes. Years had passed since the watch last changed hands. It had rested quietly inside a wooden box in a small attic, wrapped in the same piece of cloth his daughter had used to protect it. Dust gathered around it, but somehow, the watch itself still looked untouched by time. The house it slept in had changed owners many times over the years. The family who once lived there had moved away. The world outside grew louder, faster, and more digital. But one afternoon when a new family moved in, everything shifted again, quietly, almost like fate taking a deep breath before speaking again. Among the boxes they unpacked was an old trunk left behind by the previous owners. Most of it was filled with yellowed papers and faded photos, but buried underneath was a small wooden box tied with a thin, fraying ribbon. A young man in his 20s found it. He was helping his mother clean out the attic, not expecting anything interesting. He opened the box and froze when he saw the watch. Its metal had dulled with age, but it still looked special, solid, well-made, and somehow alive. When he turned it over, he saw the faint engraving on the back. The words were still visible, though softened by time. "Keep believing. Something about those two words hit him hard. He didn't know why. Maybe because he'd been going through a hard time lately. His life had been full of uncertainty. He had dropped out of college a few months earlier, unsure of what to do next. The future felt blurry, and he often told himself that maybe believing didn't help anymore. But here was this watch, old, forgotten, still ticking faintly even after so many years, carrying a message that felt like it was meant for him. He wound it carefully, unsure if it would work. At first nothing happened. Then, just as he was about to give up, he heard the faintest tick. He smiled without realizing it. Later that evening, he showed it to his mother. She gasped when she saw the name faintly scratched inside the lid of the box. It matched a family name she vaguely remembered hearing from her own grandmother. After searching a bit online, they discovered an old article written years ago in a short story. Shared by a local newspaper, it was about a man who had bought a secondhand watch and discovered a hidden message that led him back to his family's past. The young man read the story in silence, every line making his chest tighten a little more. It felt too personal to be coincidence. The details were old, but the message still felt alive. When he finished reading, he sat for a long time staring at the watch on the table. He didn't know the man who once owned it. He didn't know his family, his struggles, or his life, but somehow, through all the years and all the hands it had passed through, the message still reached him, at a time he needed it most. That night, he wore the watch for the first time. He didn't wind it again. He just let it tick softly beside him as he sat near the window, thinking about everything he'd been unsure of. The steady sound of time felt comforting, almost like someone whispering, "It's okay. You'll find your way." In the following days, something changed in him. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was quiet, like the way dawn slowly replaces darkness. He started applying for courses again, reached out to old friends, and began fixing things around the house. It was as if the watch didn't just tell time. It reminded him that he had time. One weekend, he took the watch to a local repair shop to get it cleaned. The old watchmaker there examined it closely and smiled. "This is a fine piece," he said. "They don't make them like this anymore. It's been well cared for." The young man nodded. "Yeah, it feels different. Like it has a story." The watchmaker looked up and said, "Oh, they all do. But some stories are just louder than others." The young man smiled, not knowing that the same words had once been spoken to someone else decades ago, by another shopkeeper, in another small store, when this story had first begun. That evening, he sat down and wrote in his journal, "Found an old watch in the attic. Don't know who it belonged to, but it says keep believing. Maybe that's what I need to do." He wore it every day after that. Not because it was valuable, but because it made him feel grounded. The ticking became a small reminder that every second was another chance to start over, to keep trying, to keep believing. Months passed. Life slowly began to take shape again. He joined a photography course, started traveling, meeting people, seeing the world through new eyes. And everywhere he went, the watch went too, silent, steady, constant. Sometimes people noticed it and asked about it. He never told the full story. He would just smile and say, "It's an old watch, found it by chance. It reminds me to believe in timing." He didn't know that by saying that. He was keeping the story alive, passing it forward in a new form. Years later, when someone else would find that same watch, maybe long after he was gone, they too would turn it over, read the same words, and feel that same quiet pull in their chest. Because stories like these don't end. They just move, from one heart to another, from one lifetime to the next, each person adding a piece of their own before passing it forward again. And somewhere, in the stillness of another moment, another life, the watch would tick once more, steady and calm, whispering the same message it always had: keep believing.